we have some great data, finally, as to the top 10 best-selling games across Europe, both for physical and digital sales figures. First of all, let's take a look at the top 10. This includes, once again, both digital and physical units. So the best-selling game in Europe, for the game sales data that we have here, for February of last month, Helldivers 2 has earned the top spot, far outselling everything else that's on this list. At number 2, we have EA Sports. And at number 3, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And I will be providing some extra commentary on what's going on with Rebirth and its sales. And then, of course, we have Grand Theft Auto 5, unsurprisingly. A Call of Duty game, unsurprisingly. Red Dead Redemption 2, another Rockstar game, unsurprisingly. Hogwarts Legacy, unsurprisingly. It Takes Two, Skull and Bones, and Need for Speed Heat, which is an interesting one. Those were the top 10 games for Europe for the month of February. There is some missing data here because GSD doesn't track every single game. There is a game particularly that's missing on this list because the GSD doesn't track it, and that's Palworld. If Palworld was included, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth would most definitely be knocked out of its number 3 spot. I'd imagine Palworld would be, I'm not sure if it would take over EA Sports, but I think there's a good possibility it would be number 2. Let's go over the data here. And this data is, once again, by Christopher Dring, head of games, B2B. So 16.74 million video games were sold across Europe during the month of February. And this is a rise of 21.2% over the previous February from last year. But there's a few differences. Hogwarts Legacy, which was the best-selling game of last year, came out in February last year. And if you take a look at Hogwarts Legacy's performance from last February, it technically outsold everything that's on this list for that particular month of last year. And as I noted earlier, Palworld, which is a big performer as well, is not included because the developer isn't tracked by the GSD. And the GSD, they track all games sold in the physical retail European markets as well as digital sales from the majority of major AAA publishers. And there's a list of those right here. Now, let's take a look at what was going on with Helldivers 2 regarding its sales performance last month. So Helldivers 2 was released on both PC and PS5, but the interesting part about it is that most of the game's sales in Europe, over half of its sales came from the PC version, which is phenomenal. That's a phenomenal piece of data right there. If anything, that should send a huge signal to Sony to say, hey, we should release our games on PC, the same day, our exclusives on PC the same day as the console counterpart, because there's a very good possibility, especially if it's a multiplayer game, that particular title will do better. It will perform better on PC versus the console, the home console that it's exclusive to. And Helldivers 2 proves that. Over 56% of its sales came from the PC platform. Again, that's phenomenal right there. Fantastic piece of data. Not only did Helldivers 2 sell better on PC, with over 56% of its sales coming from that platform, but it also did better in its second week compared to its launch week. The sales for the game increased by 70% in its second week, and then over another 3% in its third week. And of course, like every game, it did slow down, but only slightly. The sales fell 28% in week 4. Most video games drop in sales after 1 week, falling between 60 to 80% being the norm, as this article suggests. Now, compared to other Sony exclusives, other PlayStation 5 exclusives, when it comes to Helldivers 2, the game's sales are tracking just 5% behind Spider-Man 2. And Spider-Man 2 sold 10 million within, 3 months of it being on the market. and that game was only, and still is only, available on PS5. It hasn't made the jump to PC just yet. So that's incredible for Helldivers 2. That's an incredible performance. Those are strong numbers, very strong numbers. Now it says EA Sports FC24 continues to do well at number 4. I think that's a typo because it's sitting at the number 2 spot. Grand Theft Auto 5 has the number 4 spot. So that's clearly a typo right there. Now let's look at the number 3 spot. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. So this game was released in its standard edition, not counting the deluxe edition and all that. Only diehard fans, fanatics buy stuff like that, so we're not counting that. The game was also available in the double pack with the original, the first game, Final Fantasy VII Remake, which made it to the number 39 spot in the charts. Now, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, it had a strong critical reception, 92, around the 92, 93 on Metacritic. Most of the people that bought the game are saying that they really like it and that they enjoy it, but clearly that's not translating to sales. And you also have to note that when it comes to a game like Final Fantasy, the first week sales are coming from the people that really adore the franchise and will purchase anything that a company like Square Enix will release to market. Basically blind supporters. Since Final Fantasy is nowhere near as popular as it used to be, that number is clearly going to drop off after the first week, which is what happened with Final Fantasy XVI that was released last year, and that's exactly what's happened with Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. The game has underperformed in comparison to the first game. The opening sales were down 23% over its predecessor, which includes the sales of the double pack. And it's saying, Final Fantasy VII Remake, came out with a bigger install base on the PS4 when it initially came out in 2020. And then there was the COVID-19 lockdowns when games were in higher demand, which is really an excuse because of Final Fantasy XVI. Final Fantasy XVI, that game came out last year. That game pretty much had the same market conditions that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth had when it launched. Final Fantasy XVI didn't really have any competition on release. It was released as a console exclusive. You couldn't play the game anywhere but on PlayStation 5. And still, at least when it comes to physical units, Final Fantasy XVI has outsold Final Fantasy VII Rebirth at its launch compared to Rebirth's launch. Now, when you add in the digital units, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth actually has outperformed Final Fantasy XVI at release, but just under 4%. So that's not really a win for Square Enix, and it's not really a win for the Final Fantasy series. And it's not a win for the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. I also have to note here, because there's two things that I didn't mention in the last video, that I didn't mention verbally. I posted a comment saying that WWE 2K24 knocked out, at least in the UK, it knocked out Final Fantasy VII Rebirth out of its top spot for physical unit sales. I think when it comes to video game sales, I think the UK is the country that sells the most over there. And, for a game like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth to be knocked out of its top spot by, a sports game, which is what WWE 2K24 is, I mean, that's really pathetic. It's sad. Huge drop-off at around 89% after its first week in the UK. Now, when you factor in all of the, sales all across Europe, the fact that the game, it did outperform Final Fantasy XVI at release, but the fact that it did so at just under 4%, I mean, does Square Enix really need to release the digital sales at this point? Or the overall sales figures? They really don't. And this is the other point that I'm going to make. Square Enix traditionally will not hesitate to release a sales figure for their digital games. It's going on 3 weeks. If I take a look at my my calendar here, this is the third week. The third full week that Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has been out on the market, and Square Enix has yet to release a sales figure. They're being awkwardly quiet, very silent on the whole issue, and that is sign enough that the game hasn't really done well when it comes to overall sales. Now, I am curious as to what the game has done overall. I'm curious as to how Final Fantasy VII Rebirth has performed in the US for both physical and digital, units. I'd imagine that the US is the country where it sold the most. But once again, Final Fantasy, the series, the franchise as a whole, is nowhere near as popular as it used to be due to Square Enix just making terrible decisions for over the past 15 years and counting. And a lot of people didn't really care for the first game because the first game wasn't even really a full, remake. It wasn't the full remake that people expected it to be. And then when you combine in, changes with the combat system, changes with the story, and the false advertising and the lies and the false promises that were made about the game, it's very clear, it's very obvious why the game, the second game hasn't sold as well as the first. That's very sad for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, and it could lead to a number of changes for the third game, considering this is supposed to be a trilogy and they have one more game that they're planning on making. I'd imagine the budget for the third game will be smaller than, what Remake and Rebirth's budget was. That could affect a number of different things. But yeah, that's not good. Not good for Square Enix. Not good for Final Fantasy. We have Ubisoft's Skull and Bones, which made the number 9 spot, but its opening 3 weeks are 30% lower compared to that of Sea of Thieves, which was released back in the same period around March of 2018. And just out of the top 10, this is another interesting case right here with Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League charting at the number 12 spot. Its opening 5 weeks are 33% lower than what Gotham Knights managed in 2022, and it's 61% lower than what Guardians of the Galaxy managed to achieve in 2021. So yeah, that game flopped, and WB Games admitted as such, and I made a recent video on that on the channel. Now, we also have console sales here, which have fallen. The GSD doesn't track all European markets when it comes to console sales. 2 major markets that are missing is Germany and the UK. But apparently they also have the UK data here in a separate link. Now, the PS5, the sales are down just 2% year on year. Sony dropped their forecast with the PS5, but I'm not going to get into all that. And then we have the Switch, which is, 7 years old, down 17%. And Xbox, poor Xbox. Series S and X sales are down 47% across Europe. Yeah, that's not very good. But yeah, that's all of the GSD data that we have for February 2024. Some very interesting numbers and performances from various games that were released. And I'm curious as to how Helldivers 2 will continue to perform as new games are released to market. I'd imagine that Stellar Blade's not going to sell that great because that's aimed at a niche audience. Same goes with Rise of the Ronin. And since those games are gated to the PS5 and they're not going to have a PC release, at least for the time being, there's no reason to think or believe that those games will have this, outstanding performance when it comes to sales, especially considering they're single-player games, niche single-player games at that. Dragon's Dogma 2, I'm very curious as to how that game's going to perform. That comes out at the end of the week, so we'll just have to see what happens with that game. I think that will definitely be a Game of the Year contender, but when it comes to sales, it's Capcom. I think it's going to perform fairly decent, probably around 4 to 5 million units, but we'll just have to see how all that goes.